Jason Miller had been driving trucks for over a decade. He knew every bump and curve on the roads he traveled, and he had the rhythm of the highway down to an art. A veteran of long hauls across the vast United States, Jason was used to the isolation, the monotony, and the constant hum of the engine beneath him. His truck, an old Freightliner with a faded paint job, had become his second home, and he could spend days on end without feeling lonely. Just him, the open road, and the endless horizon. But that night, something felt different. Jason had taken a job hauling freight from Texas to a small town in Arizona. The route was straightforward, nothing too complicated. The road was empty, the sky clear, and the desert stretched out in front of him like an endless sea of sand and dust. It was the perfect conditions for a night drive. He'd been on the road for hours, and the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt had started to lull him into a trance. It was late, and he was getting tired, but there was something comforting about the solitude of the highway. As he neared a small, run-down diner on the side of the road, he decided to pull over for a break. He needed coffee, and more importantly, he needed a moment to stretch his legs. The diner looked like the kind of place where truckers went to rest and grab a quick meal before heading back out on the road. The neon sign flickered in the night, casting an eerie glow across the desert landscape. Jason parked his rig and walked toward the diner, feeling the cool desert air brush against his face. The moment he stepped inside, a wave of discomfort washed over him. It wasn't anything overt, just a subtle, creeping feeling that something was off. The diner was dimly lit, with only a few scattered patrons at the counter. The smell of stale coffee and greasy food hung in the air. The old man behind the counter nodded at Jason as he entered, his wrinkled face breaking into a faint smile. "Long night, huh?" the man said, pouring a cup of coffee from an old, chipped pot. Jason nodded and slid into a booth, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him. "Yeah, just need a quick break." The old man handed him the coffee and leaned in slightly, his voice lowering as if he was sharing a secret. "You know, you shouldn't be out on these roads at night." Jason raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one was listening. "These roads, they've got a way of taking people. Not many know about it, but there's a curse on these highways. They say some roads, especially out here in the desert, don't let you leave. You drive through them, and you're never the same." Jason chuckled, trying to brush off the man's words. "Sounds like an old man's tale." The man stared at him, his eyes dark and serious. "Maybe, but I've seen enough to know better. Just be careful out there." Jason didn't know whether to laugh or to be concerned, but he paid for the coffee and left the diner quickly, shaking his head at the absurdity of the conversation. It was just an old man telling stories to pass the time, nothing more. But as he returned to his truck and settled into the driver's seat, that strange feeling didn't go away. The silence outside seemed heavier now, almost suffocating. He glanced in his mirrors, but all he could see was the empty stretch of highway behind him. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. The road was still empty, just him and the vast desert around him. It wasn't long before he saw it. A truck, coming up fast in his rearview mirror. At first, it seemed like any other truck, another night driver just like him. But as it got closer, Jason noticed something strange. The truck didn't have its headlights on. No lights at all. It was moving in eerie silence, as if it were a ghost, following him, getting closer and closer. Jason's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to ignore the growing panic in his chest. He sped up, thinking he could outrun it, but the truck stayed right behind him, its silhouette looming in his mirrors. Suddenly, Jason's heart skipped a beat. The truck wasn't just following him. It was matching his speed, staying perfectly in sync with his every move. No matter how fast he drove, it stayed right there, always in the shadows, never revealing itself fully. He could feel the coldness creeping into the cab, and a shiver ran down his spine. He glanced again into the rearview mirror. The truck was still there, But now something was different. The windows, dark and reflective, gave no indication of who or what was inside. And then, for just a split second, he thought he saw something move in the cab. Something that wasn't human. Jason's foot slammed on the accelerator as fear took hold of him. He needed to get away from that thing, whatever it was. But as he pushed the truck to its limits, the other vehicle remained right behind him, almost mocking him. It didn't matter how fast he drove, the truck wouldn't let go. The road ahead seemed endless. The highway stretched out into nothingness, and the dark shape behind him remained, silent and unyielding. Jason's mind raced. Was it another driver, playing some sick game with him? Or was it something else? The words of the old man from the diner echoed in his mind. These roads, they don't let you leave. The wind howled through the desert as the truck behind him closed the distance once more. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The truck behind him was still there, its eerie presence pressing down on him like a heavy weight. No matter how fast he accelerated, it never seemed to get any further away. His headlights cast long shadows across the road, but the truck's outline remained clear in his rearview mirror, silent, relentless, and unyielding. It's just another trucker, playing some sick game, Jason thought to himself, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe he's messing with me. He'll pass soon enough. But the truck never passed. Instead, it stayed right behind him, its blacked-out windows reflecting the dim light of his own truck's headlights. Jason could feel a growing sense of dread gnawing at him, but he pushed it down, focusing on the road ahead. A mile passed, then two. Jason pressed harder on the gas pedal, his foot nearly to the floor, but the truck seemed to match his speed exactly. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the air inside the cab grew thick and cold. What the hell is going on? He glanced down at his GPS, hoping to see a familiar stretch of road or a sign that might offer some reassurance. The screen was dark, completely frozen. He tried fiddling with the buttons, but nothing worked. He looked at the road ahead, hoping to see a sign of civilization, maybe a gas station or another diner. But there was nothing, just endless desert and the winding, empty highway. That's when the truck behind him made its move. With a sharp, almost imperceptible lurch, the truck accelerated. Jason's pulse shot through the roof as he saw the vehicle move closer, its massive frame pulling up beside him on the left. The air around him felt electric, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He could see the truck now. It was an older model, dark and battered, with no lights and no distinguishing marks. The cab seemed empty. There was no driver, at least, not one he could see. The space inside was a void, like something was swallowing the light around it. Jason's foot hovered over the brake, but before he could react, the truck swerved violently, cutting him off. He slammed his hand on the horn, but the other vehicle didn't budge. It kept pulling ahead, slowly, deliberately, as if toying with him. In that moment, Jason knew. This wasn't just some strange coincidence. This wasn't another trucker messing with him. Whatever was in that truck, it wasn't human. His breath came in short gasps as panic set in. His hands shook, and the world outside seemed to blur as he tried to regain control of the wheel. But the truck in front of him was blocking the road now, and there was nowhere to go. He could feel his stomach twist with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck pulled back into the rearview mirror. Jason's foot hit the brake without thinking. The truck vanished from view, leaving only the empty highway behind him. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Jason pulled over to the side of the road, his hands still gripping the wheel, his heart racing in his chest. He couldn't process what had just happened. It's just the exhaustion, he thought. I'm just tired. I need some rest. But even as the words formed in his mind, he knew they weren't true. Something had happened. Something he couldn't explain. The silence was broken by the screeching of tires, distant but growing louder. Jason's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. The truck was back. This time, it was coming fast, too fast. The headlights appeared on the horizon, but they weren't like any headlights Jason had ever seen. They were a sickly yellow, a light that didn't seem to belong to any vehicle. It wasn't the kind of light that illuminated the road. No, this light was almost wrong, casting strange, shifting shadows across the desert. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he slammed his foot back on the accelerator. The truck was close now, and it wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. It was gaining on him, faster than anything he'd ever experienced. His truck roared to life as he pushed the engine to its limit. But no matter how fast he went, the headlights grew larger, closer, more insistent. Jason could feel his heart in his throat now, and he knew, deep down, that he wasn't going to outrun this thing. He glanced in the rearview mirror once more, and that's when he saw it. The truck wasn't just following him anymore. It was moving with him. The headlights seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own, as though the two vehicles were locked in some unholy dance. Jason tried to veer off the road, but the truck matched his every move. It was as if it knew exactly what he was going to do before he did it. In a blind panic, Jason swerved the truck hard to the right, off the road and onto the loose gravel. His tires screamed in protest, but the truck behind him didn't lose ground. Instead, it followed him onto the shoulder, the massive tires kicking up dust as it stayed right behind him, as though it were taunting him. Jason's mind raced for a way out. There had to be something, some way to escape. His eyes darted around the horizon, looking for anything, any sign of civilization. But the desert was empty. There was nothing. No lights. No signs. Just the road and the endless black sky above. And then, in the distance, he saw something. A small light. A glow. Faint but unmistakable. His heart leaped in his chest as he saw a gas station up ahead, barely visible through the dust and darkness. It was a long shot, but it was the only option he had. With all his strength, he twisted the wheel and aimed the truck toward the light. He could see the shape of the gas station now, small and weathered, but real. His hope flared, but it quickly faded when he saw the truck's headlights shift, moving with him once again. He slammed on the gas, his truck lurching forward. The gas station was getting closer, but he could hear the other truck gaining on him. The sickly yellow lights were too close now, too close to ignore. Jason's heart raced as he shot toward the station, hoping against hope that he would make it. The other truck, however, was still there, closing in with every passing second. The gas station loomed ahead, but the question remained. Would he make it before it was too late? Jason's truck roared as he pushed it to its limits, the engine screaming under the strain. The gas station was still a few hundred yards ahead, but the truck behind him was closing in fast. The yellow headlights were so close now, their glow filling the mirrors and casting a sickly light across the road. Jason could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The station loomed larger with every passing second, and he tried to calculate the distance in his head. I can make it. I have to make it. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the truck swaying slightly as he sped toward the small oasis of light. It wasn't much, just a few gas pumps, a dimly lit convenience store, and a flickering neon sign that barely managed to stay on. But to Jason, it was a lifeline. If he could just get there, if he could just make it to the safety of that lonely, rundown gas station, maybe, just maybe, he could outrun whatever this thing was. The air in the cab felt thick and suffocating, as though the desert itself were closing in on him. The heat from the engine, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It was all becoming too much. Sweat dripped down his face, and his eyes burned from the effort of keeping his focus on the road. He could hear the other truck behind him now, the faint hum of its engine, its tires gripping the asphalt like an iron vise. He dared another glance in the rearview mirror, and his stomach twisted. The truck was right there. It wasn't even trying to overtake him anymore. It was simply following, matching his speed with terrifying precision. Jason felt a cold chill run through him. This thing wasn't just chasing him, it was stalking him. Every move he made, it mirrored. Every time he sped up, it sped up. Every time he swerved, it swerved. The gas station was closer now, almost within reach. He could see the faded sign, the flickering lights. But just as hope began to rise, the truck behind him made a sudden move. The air in the cab seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping like a stone. Jason's eyes widened as the other truck swerved into the lane beside him. This wasn't a normal lane change. The truck's tires screeched as it pulled alongside his own rig, and for a terrifying moment, the two trucks were traveling side by side. Jason's hand was already on the horn, his heart racing as he tried to maneuver his truck to the left to avoid the massive vehicle, but it was as though the other truck was deliberately blocking him. His eyes darted between the road and the mirror, and then, for a brief moment, he saw it. The driver's side of the other truck was dark, completely dark. No lights, no reflection from the street lamps, just an inky blackness where a driver should have been. Jason's blood ran cold. He couldn't make sense of it. The truck was real, but the cab was empty. Panic surged through him. What was happening? What was this thing? His grip on the wheel tightened as the truck beside him edged even closer, the tires of both vehicles now mere inches apart. The wind whipped around them, kicking up dust and debris in a violent whirlwind. He heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the other truck's direction. It was a low hum, like the truck itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with energy that shouldn't have existed. Jason's eyes shot toward the side window, and his stomach churned as he saw the air ripple in front of him. It was like the very space between him and the other truck was distorting, warping, and then, without warning, the road ahead of him started to change. The smooth, dark asphalt seemed to buckle, the lines of the lane twisting and shifting as though the earth itself were being torn apart. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the truck veered left, suddenly swerving toward him, its massive grille just inches from the side of his own truck. No! He jerked the wheel to the right, slamming into the gravel shoulder of the road. His truck fishtailed violently, the tires screeching as he fought to regain control. The other truck, however, was unrelenting, staying right with him, no matter how hard he tried to escape. In a split second, Jason's truck hit something, a deep rut in the gravel, something that caused his vehicle to lurch violently to the right. He felt the truck slide and then tip, just a little, as if it were about to flip. His stomach dropped, and he instinctively reached for the seatbelt, though he knew it wouldn't save him. He braced for the crash, for the inevitable impact. But the impact never came. Instead, there was a sudden silence, an eerie, unnatural stillness that hung in the air like a thick fog. Jason opened his eyes, blinking against the disorientation. His truck had stopped moving, the engine idling in a soft purr. Confused, he looked around. The gas station was still ahead of him, but it was different. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the pumps and the small store. And, most unnervingly, the other truck was gone. No headlights in the distance, no silhouette in his mirrors. It was as though it had never been there at all. Jason sat in the truck, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking, his mind racing. What was going on? What was that truck? The silence around him seemed to grow louder. The wind howled through the desert, but it was the only sound. Jason shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the gas station once more. He had to get out of the truck. He had to find someone, ask them what the hell was going on. With one last look around, Jason threw open the door and stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel. He walked toward the gas station, his mind still reeling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that was beyond his understanding. As he got closer, he saw the dim figure of a man standing near the entrance of the convenience store, his back turned, as if waiting for Jason to approach. The man's shape was vague, indistinct, just a shadow in the flickering light. "Hey!" Jason called out, his voice shaky. "What's going on here? What was that truck?" The figure didn't turn. Instead, a voice, a low, almost whispering voice, came from the man's direction, carried by the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." Jason froze. The voice, low and rasping, came again, but this time with a faint, unnatural echo to it. Jason's body froze. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to turn around, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure stood there, motionless, his back still turned, as if he hadn't heard Jason at all. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice repeated. This time more clearly. It was coming from the man's direction, but there was something strange about it, something unsettling. It wasn't just the wind carrying the words. They seemed to come from all around him, vibrating in the air, slipping through the cracks in his mind. Jason's heart raced. He wanted to call out again, to ask the man what he meant, but his throat was tight, and his words caught in his chest. He took a hesitant step forward, but the figure didn't move. It was as if the space between them had become vast and unyielding, an invisible barrier keeping him from getting closer. "Who are you?" Jason finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse and thin, like he wasn't sure it was even his own. "What's going on here? What was that truck?" There was no answer, at least not right away. For a long moment, all Jason could hear was the wind, a distant howl across the desert. The figure remained motionless, his back still turned to Jason, but then, the figure began to move. Slowly, purposefully, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings, it turned its body, just slightly, until Jason could see the outline of the man's face. His eyes were dark, pools of ink, black and endless. The skin on his face was pale, almost translucent, like it hadn't seen the light of day in years. His clothes were simple, old, faded jeans, a worn leather jacket, and boots that looked like they'd been through 100 miles of desert. But his presence was far from ordinary. Jason took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he was rooted to the spot, as if something, some force, was holding him in place. "You've been driving these roads for a long time, haven't you?" the figure said, his voice now soft and almost soothing, like a lullaby sung from a distance. Long enough to feel the weight of it all. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. The air around him seemed to thicken, and every breath felt like it was harder to take. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. What do you mean?" The figure took a slow step forward, its movements almost gliding across the ground, as if the man wasn't walking at all but hovering just above it. Jason instinctively took a step back, his mind racing. There was something about this man, about the way he moved, the way he looked, that felt wrong, like he didn't belong in this world. "You're not the first," the man continued, his voice growing softer with each word. "This highway, these roads, they have a way of pulling people in, and once you're in, there's no getting out, no escape." Jason's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" He repeated, his voice shaking now, the fear rising in his chest. The figure's eyes locked onto Jason's, and in that instant, Jason felt like he was being pulled into them. It was as though the man's gaze held a power, a gravity that sucked everything else out of the world. The desert, the gas station, the road. Everything blurred and faded into nothing. "You've driven this road, haven't you?" the figure whispered, stepping closer now. Jason felt his body stiffen. "You've seen it all. The lonely nights, the empty miles, the endless stretches of asphalt. But what you don't know is what happens when you go too far. When you push past the edge of the map." The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, the wind suddenly still, and the world felt as though it was holding its breath. Jason's mind was racing. "The edge of the map? What do you mean? What's out there?" The figure's lips curled into a slow, eerie smile. "You've seen the trucks. The ones that follow. The ones that never leave. They've been waiting for you. They're not what they seem, not what you think, but they're here. And they'll keep coming, driving you further and further, until you're lost." Jason's pulse pounded in his ears, his eyes wide with terror. "Lost? What do you mean?" "I don't understand." The figure tilted his head slightly, as if amused by Jason's confusion. "There's a place, just beyond where the road stops. A place where time doesn't exist, and the road never ends. You've been getting closer to it every time you drive, every time you push further out into the desert. But once you cross it, you'll never go back. You'll never be the same, and neither will the others." Jason's stomach dropped. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what the man was saying, but it didn't make sense. This has to be a dream, Jason thought. This can't be real. Yet, every fiber of his being screamed that it was. The man's words, his presence, everything about this moment felt otherworldly. "What do you want from me?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "What are you trying to say?" The figure took another step closer, now standing just a few feet away. Jason could feel the air around him grow even colder, a chill seeping into his bones. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a metal object that gleamed in the dim light. He held it up, showing it to Jason. It was a key to the road, the man said, his voice low and almost reverent. A key to the place where it all begins, where it all ends. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the figure held the key out to him. "Take it," the man whispered. "Take it, and you'll know the truth. You'll see what's out there. But be warned, you may not come back the same, or at all." Jason felt his chest tighten. This was madness. This whole night, this whole situation, was madness. But the man's eyes, dark and endless, seemed to draw him in, like they were pulling him towards something he didn't understand, something dangerous, something inevitable. "I don't want it," Jason said, his voice hoarse with fear. He took a step back, his feet unsteady beneath him. "I don't want any part of this." The figure smiled again, a slow, terrible smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll keep running," he said, his voice like a whisper in the wind. "You'll keep running until you can't anymore. Until you understand." Jason turned sharply, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't stay here, not another second. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it was something he couldn't escape. He ran back toward his truck, his legs shaky, his mind racing with panic. But when he reached the truck, something was different. The world around him had shifted. The gas station, the road, everything. It all felt wrong. The horizon stretched unnaturally. The stars overhead twisted in impossible directions. And in the distance, he saw it. The truck. The same one. The one with the yellow lights. The one that had followed him. It was coming again. Jason's heart slammed against his chest as he spun around. The figure still standing by the gas station in the distance. His eyes locked on Jason's every move. The sickly yellow headlights of the truck in the distance had grown brighter, closer, and the low hum of its engine vibrated through the air, sending a shiver down Jason's spine. The world seemed to be closing in on him, the horizon warping, the road stretching out in front of him, longer and longer with every second. Jason's breath was shallow, and for a moment, he was paralyzed. The gas station, the figure, the truck. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was real, too real. The air itself felt heavy, like the very desert around him was alive, suffocating him, pushing him closer to some terrifying conclusion. Get in the truck. Drive. Just drive, he told himself, his mind racing. He turned and bolted toward his rig, not daring to look back. His boots pounded against the gravel, his body moving on instinct. The truck was his only chance to escape. But even as he neared it, the overwhelming sense of dread grew stronger. Something was wrong with the world around him. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the inky blackness of the desert. The gas station was too still, too quiet, like it was just an illusion, something that didn't belong. He jumped into the cab of the truck, slamming the door behind him, his hands shaking as he grabbed the wheel. The engine roared to life, but even as it did, the truck in the distance didn't slow down. It was already too close, barreling down the road at an unnatural speed. Jason slammed his foot on the accelerator, the tires spinning and screeching as he pushed the truck forward. The engine howled, the roar filling the cab, but the truck behind him kept pace. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the black silhouette, the headlights burning brighter as they bore down on him. This can't be happening, Jason thought, his chest tight with panic. What is it? What is following me? The truck behind him wasn't just a truck. It was a predator, moving with purpose, closing in on him as if it knew exactly what he was going to do. Jason swerved to the right, then sharply to the left, but it was no use. The other truck matched his every move, staying right on his tail, a shadow that refused to be shaken. His grip on the wheel tightened. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He couldn't see the road clearly anymore, the lines of the highway blurring into a single, continuous stretch of black. The headlights of the pursuing truck were blinding now, too close, too overwhelming. Suddenly, the truck swerved hard to the left, moving off the road and onto the gravel shoulder. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why the other truck had done it, but it didn't matter. It was no longer following him from behind. It was beside him. Jason's eyes flicked to the side window, but there was nothing there. No truck. The space next to him was empty, an infinite void of darkness that stretched into the horizon. What the hell? Then, without warning, he felt the truck shake violently, as though it had been struck from the side. His hands jerked the wheel instinctively to the right to correct, but the truck wobbled, sliding dangerously. The tires spun out of control, gravel flying everywhere, the world spinning around him. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the truck lurched to the left again. But this time, it wasn't because of anything he had done. The truck was being pushed. Someone was pushing him, forcing him to swerve, to fight for control. His foot slammed on the brake, but the truck continued its uncontrollable spin, sliding out of his hands as the world blurred into a tornado of lights and shadows. He gripped the wheel harder, his vision narrowing. In the blur, he saw the shape again, that shadow in the distance, standing still, watching. The man, the figure. No, not now, Jason thought, his chest tight with fear. Not this. The road twisted before him, the asphalt cracking and splitting as if the very ground were falling apart beneath his truck. The gas station disappeared behind him, and in its place, the endless road stretched into darkness, a road that seemed to have no end, no destination. Jason's eyes darted back to the rearview mirror. The headlights of the pursuing truck were no longer visible. It was gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lingering, just out of sight. The desert was silent now, too silent. The hum of the engine was the only sound, the only thing that anchored him to this reality. The truck still swerved and bucked beneath him, as if something unseen was tugging at it, pulling it off course. Suddenly, the GPS screen flickered back to life, its lines of blue flashing on and off, struggling to maintain a connection. Jason's eyes darted to the screen, and his heart skipped a beat. The map had changed. The road he was on, wasn't showing up. Instead, there was just a blank space, a vast, empty expanse that stretched on forever. What is happening? In a panic, Jason slammed his hand down on the GPS, but it didn't change. The map stayed blank, and a small, haunting message appeared on the screen. Destination: unknown. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The words echoed in his mind, spinning with his thoughts. Unknown. He'd driven these roads 100 times, and he knew every mile, every turn. But this wasn't the same. It was as if the road itself had changed, as if it were no longer a part of the world he knew. As if the map was telling him he was somewhere else. Where the hell am I? His hands shook as he tried to turn the wheel, trying to regain control, but the truck was pulling in a new direction, as though the road was no longer guiding him. He was being guided, forced into an unknown path. In the distance, the headlights reappeared, growing brighter once more. Jason didn't need to look to know what it was. The other truck. It was coming again, but this time, It wasn't just pursuing him, it was surrounding him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his blood roaring in his ears. The road stretched into infinity, but there was no escape. The truck wasn't behind him anymore. It was ahead, beside him, closing in on every side. No matter how fast he drove, no matter which direction he turned, there was no way out. The road doesn't end, Jason realized. It never ends. Not here. Not in this place. The GPS flickered again, the words on the screen changing. Destination, no exit. The world around him warped. The road twisted. The sky darkened. The headlights of the pursuing truck swallowed the world in their glow, blinding Jason to everything else. And then, as if from nowhere, a soft voice whispered through the static of the truck's radio, cold and hollow. "You can never leave." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The words echoed in his mind as the world around him faded into darkness. Jason's heart thundered in his chest, the air in the truck thick and suffocating. The voice from the radio, low, distorted, and chilling, lingered in his mind as the world around him began to warp even further. The endless road stretched out ahead, a dark, never-ending ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the night. The truck, the other truck, it was there with him, but it wasn't just behind him anymore. It was all around him. The GPS flickered again, the map still blank, an empty void that mocked his sense of direction. The road didn't exist here, not in the way he understood it. There were no exits, no turns, no signs. Only the endless black, the dim glow of the headlights, and the oppressive, suffocating silence that had taken hold. This is madness, Jason thought. I'm losing my mind. This isn't real. But everything around him felt real. Too real. The engine hummed beneath him, the vibrations sending waves of unease through his body. The temperature in the truck had dropped, the cold creeping into his bones, making his hands tremble as they gripped the wheel. He couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. Every time he tried to turn off the road, the truck resisted, pulling him back onto the path, steering him into the darkness. He glanced again at the rearview mirror. The headlights of the other truck were still there, but there was something different about them. They didn't flicker like normal headlights. They burned with an unnatural intensity, glowing like twin orbs of molten yellow, their reflection in the mirror distorting the very air around him. What the hell is this? Jason's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in confusion. The truck wasn't just following him anymore. It was part of him. The two vehicles were connected, bound by something beyond his understanding. Jason slammed the accelerator to the floor, hoping the truck would respond, hoping to escape the strange gravitational pull of the other vehicle. But the truck didn't speed up. Instead, it began to slow, almost as if it were being deliberately dragged into the darkness. The radio crackled again, the voice whispering through the static. "You can never leave, Jason. You were never meant to." The words sliced through him like a blade. His stomach twisted into a tight knot. "It knows my name. It knows me." Suddenly, the headlights of the truck behind him surged forward, casting a blinding glare through the cab of Jason's truck. The light was so bright it felt like it was burning into his skin, searing his eyes. Jason slammed his hand against the dashboard, trying to get the radio to work, to block out the haunting voice. But the static only grew louder, the voice growing clearer. "The road, it takes you, Jason. It chooses." The truck jolted, as if it had hit an invisible barrier. The wheel jerked from his hands, and the steering became unresponsive. He struggled with it, trying to pull the truck back on course, but it was useless. It was as though the road itself had a life, and it had decided where he was going. No, 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 no. The truck veered sharply to the left. Jason gritted his teeth and fought against the pull, but his efforts were in vain. The vehicle was being dragged in a direction he couldn't control. The road stretched endlessly ahead, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic, growing narrower and darker with every second. A loud thud vibrated through the truck, and Jason slammed his foot on the brake, his pulse racing. The truck screeched to a halt. The world outside seemed to freeze for a brief moment, an unnatural stillness that hung in the air like a suspended breath. Jason stared at the road in front of him. It was different. The asphalt now stretched into an impossible loop, a circular path that seemed to repeat itself over and over again. The gas station was nowhere in sight, but the highway ahead appeared to lead into itself, creating an endless, infinite cycle. Every mile he drove seemed to bring him back to the same point, as though the road was a loop, an unbreakable loop that kept him trapped inside. His hands clenched around the wheel, his knuckles white. He tried to force the truck into reverse, but the gears wouldn't shift. The engine whined, but it didn't respond. Then, through the window, Jason saw it. A faint figure, standing on the side of the road. The same figure from the gas station. He stood motionless, his back turned, watching Jason with that same, haunting stillness. The faint yellow glow of the headlights illuminated his silhouette, but his face was hidden in the shadows. Jason's heart raced. No, not again. Not him. The figure began to move, slowly, its gait unervingly smooth, as if it were gliding across the road, not walking. Jason wanted to scream, to yell at him to go away, to leave him alone, but his mouth was dry, his voice trapped in his throat. The figure came closer and closer, until it stood directly outside the window. Jason could see his face now. It was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those black, empty eyes, stared through Jason, as though looking past him into the depths of something beyond comprehension. The man's lips parted slightly, and the same whispering voice that had been coming through the radio now spoke directly to him. "You've crossed the line, Jason. You're one of us now." Jason's blood ran cold. He wanted to look away, to turn the truck around and escape, but he couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the man, on those hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into his soul. The man's mouth twisted into a thin smile. "You've driven these roads long enough to understand," he said, his voice carrying an unnatural calm. "Now you'll drive them forever." Jason's pulse thundered in his ears. "What do you mean? What are you? What is this place?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he simply gestured to the road ahead with a slow, deliberate motion. The highway stretched out into the distance, and Jason noticed something new, something impossible. The road was changing. The asphalt was cracking, the edges warping and twisting, forming impossible angles, folding in on itself like some grotesque version of reality. The lights from the truck behind him were starting to pulse in rhythm, like a heartbeat, an eerie synchronization that echoed in the air. "Look closely," the figure said, his voice cold as ice. "It doesn't end. Not for you. Not for anyone who's been chosen." Jason's head spun. "Chosen? No, I'm just a trucker, just passing through. This doesn't make sense." He could feel his breath catch in his throat, the panic rising, the sense of reality slipping through his fingers. Everything he thought he knew about the world, about this life, it was slipping away, fading into something far darker. The man's smile widened. "You're already lost," he whispered, "and soon they'll all be lost with you." Jason slammed his foot on the accelerator again, but the truck didn't respond. The engine roared in defiance, but it was as though something was holding it in place. The figure didn't move, his eyes still locked onto Jason, watching him with a knowing expression. And then, in the distance, Jason saw it. The truck. The yellow headlights were coming again. But this time, they weren't just behind him. They were coming from every direction, from all sides of the road, from all points of the horizon. The trucks were closing in. Jason was trapped. Jason's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, heart pounding in his chest. The figure outside his window didn't move. His black, hollow eyes stared through him, past him, seeing something Jason could never hope to understand. The whisper of the voice, now deep and unsettling, echoed in his mind, resonating with a terrifying truth. "You're already lost." The words kept repeating in his head. Jason wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something, anything to break free from this suffocating nightmare. But his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in the cab of his truck, the world around him warping and changing in ways that defied all reason. The headlights, those unblinking yellow eyes of the truck, were closing in again. But this time, they were coming from every direction, from every side. It wasn't just one truck anymore. It was many, a sea of dark shapes, all moving closer, relentlessly, inexorably. Jason pressed his foot to the gas, but the truck didn't move. It remained eerily still. The engine roared in frustration, but nothing changed. The world outside his window was now a blur of darkness, the headlights growing brighter, illuminating the road, his truck, and everything around him in an otherworldly glow. He glanced at the GPS. The screen was still blank. No map, no directions. Just an empty void where the road should have been. The voice from the radio crackled again, filling the cab with its distorted whispers, growing louder until it drowned out all other sound. You can't escape, Jason. Not now. Not ever. The chill in the air intensified, freezing Jason's breath, his skin, his very soul. It was like the desert itself had become a prison, a vast, eternal prison with no escape, no way out, no way to run. He looked through the windshield again, trying to make sense of the chaos, trying to find something, anything that could give him hope. But there was nothing. No signposts, no buildings, no landmarks, just an infinite stretch of highway, swallowed by darkness. Suddenly, there was a thud, sharp and violent. The truck jerked to one side, the front tires screeching against the asphalt. Jason gripped the wheel harder, his eyes wide in terror, but he couldn't control it. The truck veered left, then right, as though caught in the grip of an invisible hand. The steering wheel jerked violently in his hands, and the sound of the tires scraping the road sent a shiver of panic down his spine. Another thud, and then a voice, clear and cold, cutting through the radio static. Do you hear it, Jason? The sound of the road calling you. The sound of the end. Jason's mind reeled. The end? Was this it? Was this the moment he crossed over into some other place? Some other world where time didn't exist? He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He slammed his foot on the brake, but the truck didn't slow down. It was as though the brakes themselves had stopped working, as if the vehicle was no longer responding to his commands. The headlights of the pursuing trucks grew closer. No, they were surrounding him now. Jason's pulse raced. His body tensed. He was trapped. The world had folded in on itself. The endless highway stretched in all directions. No beginning, no end. The trucks closed in, their headlights blinding. He couldn't see anything else, just the harsh glare of those lights, blinding him. But then, through the blinding glow, something caught his eye. A figure, a person, standing at the center of the road, just beyond the blinding headlights. Jason's breath hitched. His body screamed to stop, but it was as if his foot had forgotten how to lift from the accelerator. The figure, no, the man, stood motionless in the center of the road, facing Jason's truck. His face was obscured by shadows, but Jason could make out the faint outline of his silhouette. The voice from the radio cut through the silence again, its tones flat and emotionless. You've come so far, Jason. You've driven so many miles, seen so many roads, but now, you'll see where it all ends. Jason's mind spun. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. His truck was a prison, the highway an endless trap, and the figure, a shadow, an entity, was waiting for him to reach the inevitable point of no return. The truck was still moving forward, but Jason couldn't do anything. The wheel was locked, the gas pedal stuck. He was powerless, his body no longer responding. The world had shifted, as though the laws of physics themselves had been rewritten. The trucks were no longer following him. They had merged with the road itself, becoming part of the fabric of this nightmarish landscape. No escape, no way out. Jason could hear the voice inside his head now, echoing louder than before. The trucks were all around him, the figure standing at the end of the road, waiting, The truck lurched again, jerking violently, sending Jason's body flying against the seatbelt. He could feel his heart in his throat, the adrenaline flooding his veins. The air inside the truck was thick with the cold, like the world outside was closing in on him, suffocating him, trapping him. The figure in the road didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring at Jason, his face obscured in shadow. Jason's breath was coming in ragged gasps now, his mind dizzy from fear. He was trapped in this endless loop, with no way of breaking free. And then, as the truck barreled toward the figure, something happened. The road ahead shifted. The asphalt twisted, warping like liquid, folding over itself, and the figure in the road melted into the landscape, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. The headlights of the trucks around him began to fade, retreating into the distance, and the road, it began to vanish. Jason's eyes widened. Where did it go? Before he could process what was happening, the truck. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the road beneath him continued to shift and warp, but the truck no longer moved. It was as if the world itself had frozen in time. Every sound, every motion, suspended in a terrifying stasis. His mind raced with 100 questions. None of them had answers. The headlights of the trucks, those unnatural, burning yellow lights, flickered and dimmed, retreating like they were fading into another reality. The trucks themselves were nowhere to be seen, leaving nothing but a vast emptiness around him. The once seemingly endless road was now just a black void, swallowing everything. The desert had disappeared. The stars above had dimmed, leaving the sky a washed-out gray, like a page of an old book that had faded with time. Jason's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. He stared out of the windshield, his mind desperately trying to understand what was happening. The figure, the man who had appeared on the road, was gone. The world around him was silent, too silent. The GPS flickered to life again, its screen still blank, but this time, there was something new. A small symbol, glowing faintly in the corner of the screen. Jason didn't know what it was. It wasn't a location, wasn't a road sign, wasn't anything he recognized. But somehow, he knew it was a marker. Something that signified a place, or maybe a warning. Is this the end? Jason thought, but the words felt hollow in his mind. He had no way of knowing if it was the end of his journey, or just the beginning of something far worse. He tried to shift the truck into gear, but the shifter wouldn't respond. The engine sputtered, its once mighty roar now just a faint whimper. Jason pounded his fist against the dashboard in frustration. His thoughts were fractured, his mind a whirl of dread and confusion. He wasn't in control, not of the truck, not of the road, not of anything. He leaned back in his seat, his breath slow, his hands still gripping the wheel. The world outside the truck felt like a dream, a twisted, impossible dream. And yet, everything in the cab felt real, too real. Suddenly, a light flickered from the horizon. Jason squinted, his eyes straining against the thick darkness. The light wasn't the same as before. It wasn't from the headlights of the trucks that had been following him, nor was it from the gas station that had vanished into the night. No, this light was different. It was cold, sterile, almost mechanical in its consistency, and it was coming from above, a sharp, white glow cutting through the sky. Jason's breath hitched as the light grew closer, expanding into a blinding circle that surrounded the truck. The wind outside howled, the sound rising to a deafening pitch as the light enveloped him. The cab shook violently, the steering wheel rattling in his hands, but the truck remained still, unmoving, as though it had become part of the world itself. What the hell is happening? Jason thought again, his pulse racing. Is this the end? Then, in an instant, the light vanished. Gone. The sound of the wind died away, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Jason blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the new darkness around him. He was no longer on the road. The desert was gone. The gas station was gone. The trucks, the figure, the endless highway. They had all disappeared. Jason looked around, and his breath caught in his throat. He was somewhere else. The truck sat alone in the middle of an empty field, under a sky so dark it felt suffocating. The stars that had once been above him were now gone, replaced by a blank, gray void. There were no roads, no signs, no landmarks, just endless emptiness, and in the distance a faint sound, like a whisper on the wind, soft, almost inaudible. Jason's hands gripped the wheel tighter as the air inside the cab grew colder. The voice returned, clearer now, stronger. "You've crossed the line, Jason." The words chilled him to the core. His fingers clenched on the steering wheel as he looked around, trying to find where the voice was coming from. But there was nothing. No one. Only the oppressive silence. What does it mean? Jason thought. What line? His breath misted in front of him, the air now icy cold. His eyes darted around the empty field, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no explanation. Nothing made sense. He was still sitting in his truck, still trapped in the same nightmare. But everything had changed. The road was gone. The world had shifted. The voice spoke again, its tone cold, final. "There is no way back. You will drive forever." Jason's body went cold. He wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to break the silence that hung over him like a heavy fog. But his voice failed him. His thoughts were like fragments of glass, broken and scattered in his mind. Then, a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible hum, coming from beneath the truck. The engine. Jason's eyes widened in terror as he realized the truck was moving again. Without him touching the gas pedal, the truck began to roll forward, slowly, but with a force that felt unnatural. No, no. He tried to slam his foot on the brake, but it was too late. The truck was moving, dragging him, pulling him into the unknown. The world around him began to distort again. The empty field seemed to stretch on forever, and the truck rolled forward, its headlights illuminating nothing but a vast, gray emptiness. The hum of the engine grew louder, and Jason could feel the pull of it, like it was drawing him deeper into the darkness. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't escape. "Where are we going?" Jason whispered, his voice trembling. But the voice didn't answer this time. It didn't need to. Jason didn't need to ask anymore. The truck continued to roll, its headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. And as he looked out of the windshield, he saw the faintest outline of a road ahead, stretching into the abyss. A road that would never end.